He walked back into his house, picked up the 19th letter from the table, and threw it into the fire without reading a single word. His foreman stood in the doorway. "Sir, she hasn't even unpacked yet." "Then tell her to pack," Elias said. "And tell the lawyer no more matchmakers, no more arranged visits, no more women who want the ranch and call it love." He stared at the flames swallowing the paper. 19 women. 19 disappointments. And every single one of them had looked at this land before they ever looked at him. If this story moved something in your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very end, because what happens next will surprise you. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love knowing how far this story has traveled. Elias Blackwood did not sleep the night the 19th woman left. He sat in the leather chair near the fireplace, the one his father had sat in for 30 years before him, and he listened to the silence of the house. The kind of silence that fills a room when too many empty promises have been made in it. The walls knew it. The floors knew it. Even the fire seemed tired of burning. He was 36 years old. He owned 4,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Wyoming. He had 260 head of cattle, a bunkhouse full of loyal men, 3 barns built with his own hands, and a family name that had survived drought debt and a war that had taken almost everything from his father's generation. And he had never felt more completely alone in his life. His foreman, a barrel-chested man named Hank Doyle, knocked on the study door around 11 o'clock that night. "She's gone, sir," Hank said. He didn't come all the way in. He never did when the mood in the house felt like this. "Took the carriage back to Cheyenne. Said she'd be in touch with Mr. Farrow." Elias didn't turn around. "Wire Farrow in the morning. Tell him we're done." Done meaning I won't be receiving any more of his recommendations. He finally looked over his shoulder. Done meaning finished, closed, over. Hank nodded slowly. He'd worked for the Blackwood family for 22 years. He knew when not to push. "I'll send the wire at first light." "Thank you, Hank." The door closed. Elias turned back to the fire. He reached down beside the chair and picked up a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched in an hour. He held it without drinking. I wasn't angry exactly. He had moved past anger somewhere around the 12th visit, when a woman named Beatrice had spent 45 minutes asking about the mineral rights on the northern pasture before she'd asked his middle name. I wasn't bitter either. Bitterness required a kind of ongoing hope that kept getting crushed. He had run out of that too. What he felt now was something quieter and heavier. Something that settled in the chest the way a stone settles at the bottom of cold water. He felt finished. The story of how Elias Blackwood came to receive 19 brides was not complicated. 3 years earlier, his mother Eleanor Blackwood had decided from her house in Philadelphia that her son was working himself to death and would die alone in Wyoming, with no heir, no companion, and no one to carry the family name forward. She had connections, she had opinions, and she had a relationship with a man named Gerald Farrow, who ran what he called a discreet introduction service for wealthy families in the eastern states. Elias had not agreed to this exactly. He had agreed after months of his mother's letters to allow a few introductions. That had been his mistake. 1 introduction had become 4. 4 had become 9. And somewhere between the 9th and the 12th, Elias had realized that the women arriving on his doorstep were not coming to meet him. They were coming to audit him. They arrived beautifully dressed, carefully mannered, and precisely coached on what to say. They complimented the land. They admired the views. They asked thoughtful questions about the cattle operation and the seasonal income and whether the house had been recently modernized. They smiled at him, all of them. They laughed at the right moments. They were perfectly pleasant. And not one of them had ever asked him a single question about himself. Not once in 19 visits had a woman sat across from him at that long dinner table and said, "Tell me something about you. Not your ranch, not your family name, just you. Who are you, Elias Blackwood?" Not once. He had started testing them, quietly, without announcing it. He began mentioning early in the visits that the ranch had nearly failed 4 years ago. That there had been a period 2 brutal years when he had wondered if he would have to sell everything his father built. that he had made difficult decisions and worked 16-hour days and had taken on debt that had taken 3 years to clear. He watched their faces when he said it. Every single one of them shifted, just slightly, just enough that someone who was paying attention could see it. A small recalibration, a brief internal adjustment as their assessment of the situation changed. None of them said, "That must have been hard. How did you get through it?" They said things like, "But it's clearly all recovered now," or, "Well, the ranch looks magnificent," or in the case of one particularly ambitious woman from Boston, simply, "How reassuring, how reassuring," as if the most difficult years of his life were simply a mild inconvenience that had been tidied up before her arrival. After the 15th visit, Elias stopped telling the story. It wasn't worth it. He already knew what he would see on their faces. After the 19th, he decided he was done with all of it. The next morning, Hank sent the wire to Gerald Farrow. Farrow wired back by afternoon. "Deeply regret to hear this. Still have several excellent candidates who would be well suited to your situation. Please reconsider. Regards, Farrow." Elias read the wire once, set it on Hank's desk, and walked back out to the barn. Hank followed him. "What should I tell him if he wires again?" "Tell him I said no." "He'll say, 'Hank.'" Elias stopped walking. He turned around. He was not a man who raised his voice or made speeches. He was not built for drama. He was built for work, for early mornings and hard decisions, and the kind of patience that comes from watching weather systems cross the plains for 30 years. But when Elias Blackwood said something in a certain tone, there was a finality to it that ended conversations. "Tell him I said no, and if he wires a third time, don't bring it to me." "Yes, sir." I went into the barn. He spent the rest of the afternoon with his horses. The weeks that followed were quiet. Winter was coming early that year. Everyone in the valley could feel it. The sky had that particular gray quality that old-timers recognized, a flatness that meant the temperature would drop fast and the first real storms would arrive before November was finished. Elias threw himself into preparation. He had the fences on the North Range checked and reinforced. He ordered extra feed stores, arranged additional shelter for the breeding stock, and rode the perimeter of the property himself 3 times in the first 2 weeks of October. He worked. That was what he knew how to do. When the world felt uncertain, when the interior landscape of his life felt like it had nothing left to offer, he went back to the land. He worked until his hands ached and his back was stiff and his mind was too tired to think about anything other than what needed to be done tomorrow. The ranch hands noticed the change in him, though none of them mentioned it directly. Old Pete, the eldest of the crew at 64, said one evening over supper that the boss seemed like a man who'd decided something. Not sad exactly, just decided. Young Daniel, who had only been on the Blackwood crew for 1 season, asked what he'd decided. Pete looked at his coffee. Decided to stop waiting for something. The table was quiet after that. It was on a Thursday night in late October when it happened. The storm came in fast from the northwest. By 8 o'clock, the wind had picked up to a level that made the windows rattle in their frames. By 9, the rain had started, the kind of hard-driving rain that arrived sideways and turned the yard to mud in 20 minutes. Elias was in the study going over the winter supply ledgers when he heard the dog barking. His dog, a large mixed shepherd named Captain, almost never barked at night. The animal had been trained to alertness, not noise. He barked at strangers and at genuine threats, not at wind. Elias set down the ledger. He listened. Captain barked again, then again. 3 sharp, deliberate sounds. Someone was at the gate. Hank was already putting on his coat when Elias came into the main hall. "I'll go," Elias said. "Sir, I'll go." He took the oil lamp from the hook by the door, pulled on his coat, and went out into the rain. The gate at the front of the property was 50 yards from the house, a heavy timber structure built by his grandfather. Through the rain, in the unsteady light of the lamp, he could make out a shape, a horse head down, standing just outside the gate. And beside the horse, a figure. Small. Still. Standing in the full force of the rain without any sign of moving. He crossed the yard and held up the lamp. The figure was a woman. She was soaked through. Her coat too thin for this kind of weather. He registered that immediately was plastered against her, and her hair was flattened against her face. She was holding the horse's bridle with one hand, and in the other she carried a worn leather bag. She did not flinch when the light hit her face. She looked directly at him. That was the first thing he noticed. Not her appearance, the exhaustion on her features, the mud on her boots, the state of her clothes. He noticed that she looked directly at him. She did not look at the house. She did not look at the barns or the outbuildings or the size of the property. She looked at him. "I'm sorry to come at this hour," she said. Her voice was steady. Tired, but steady. "I was riding for the Palmer Ranch, but the creek crossing on the south road has flooded. I can't get through." He said nothing. He was looking at her horse. The animal was spent. He could see it in the way it held its weight, the slight trembling in its legs. "Is there somewhere I could shelter the horse tonight?" she said. "Just until the water drops. I can sleep in the barn if that's acceptable. I won't be any trouble." Elias looked at her. "Who are you?" "Clara Whitmore. I came up from Kansas 3 weeks ago." She paused. "I'm looking for work." Something shifted in the air. Something very small. Later, he would not be able to say exactly what it was. Just that in the middle of a storm with the rain hammering down and his oil lamp throwing wild shadows across the gate. Those 4 words landed differently than any words any woman had spoken to him in years. "I'm looking for work. Not I heard about your ranch. Not I know Mr. Farrow. Not I understand you're a man of means. Just I'm looking for work." He opened the gate. He put the horse in the 3rd stall in the smaller barn closest to the house. It was where he kept his own riding horses, and it was the driest, warmest building on the property. He didn't explain why he chose that barn. He just did. The woman, Clara Whitmore, unsaddled the horse herself. She didn't wait to be offered help. She unbuckled the straps, lifted the saddle with the practiced motion of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, and set it over the partition rail without a word. Then she reached into her bag and produced a small cloth, and she began drying the horse's neck. Elias stood in the entrance to the stall and watched her. "That horse is dehydrated," he said. "There's water in the bucket at the end of the aisle. Let him drink slowly." "I know." She didn't look up. "He's been pushed too hard today. I misjudged the distance." He noted that. She didn't make excuses. She stated a fact. "Where in Kansas?" he asked. "Abilene. We had a farm outside town." She paused for just a moment. "My husband and I. He passed 2 years ago." Silence. She kept drying the horse. "I'm sorry," he said, because it seemed like the right thing to say, and because he meant it. "Thank you." She finally looked up at him. Her eyes were dark brown, and in the lamplight they were very direct. "Is there somewhere I could get dry before I trouble you further?" Hank's wife, Martha, who helped with the cooking and household 3 days a week, had left a pot of soup on the stove before the storm hit. Elias poured a bowl for Clara Whitmore without asking whether she wanted it. She sat at the kitchen table in the chair nearest the stove, and she held the bowl with both hands for a long moment before she drank from it. He sat across from her. He told himself he was only there because it was his house, and he wanted to make sure she was actually who she said she was, which was not entirely untrue. "You said you're looking for work," he said. "Yes." "The Palmer Ranch is 3 miles further east. They've got room in their cookhouse." "I know. Mrs. Palmer offered me a position 3 weeks ago. I've been riding up from a boarding house in Laramie sorting out some things." She set the bowl down. "My husband left some debts. Nothing enormous, but enough to make things complicated for a while." Elias nodded. "What kind of work are you looking for?" She looked at him directly. It struck him again, that quality of just looking at him. At him, not at the room around him. "I can cook for a crew. I managed the kitchen and household accounts for our farm for 8 years. I can do supply records, repair clothing, and I'm competent with horses." She said it plainly. No performance, no attempt to oversell. Just here is what I can do. I'm also honest about what I can't do, which I find most people appreciate when they discover it. He almost smiled at that. He didn't. "Why didn't you go to the Palmers weeks ago?" he asked. She looked at the table for a moment, then back up at him. "I heard about a cattle operation north of here that was better run. I wanted to have options before I committed." That surprised him. "You heard about my ranch?" "I heard it's better managed than most in the area." She said it without flattery in her voice, the way someone states a fact, not the way someone compliments a powerful man. "I wanted to see for myself. See if the rumors were accurate. See if the work would be worth the distance." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're soaked through. It's nearly 10 o'clock, and you haven't asked once about the wages," he said. "I figure that's a morning conversation." She wrapped both hands around the bowl again. "Tonight, I'm just grateful for a warm stove." I gave her the small guest room at the end of the first-floor hallway. It was a plain room, a bed, a chest of drawers, a wash basin. He hadn't thought much about it in years. Guests didn't stay often. He stood in the doorway after he'd brought in an extra blanket and set it on the chest. "We can talk in the morning," he said. "If the creek's still up, you'll need to stay until it drops anyway." She was sitting on the edge of the bed pulling off her boots. "That's kind of you, Mr. Blackwood." He was halfway down the hall when she said his name. Something made him stop. "It's Elias," he said without turning back around. A pause. "Good night, Elias." He went back to the study. He sat down in the leather chair. He didn't pick up the ledger. He sat there for a long time staring at the fire, and for the life of him, he could not have told anyone what he was thinking about. Only that the house felt somehow different tonight. Not louder, not warmer exactly, just less empty. She was awake before him. He came downstairs at 5:30 in the morning, which was his usual hour, and found the kitchen warm, the stove already going, and a pot of coffee finished. Clara Whitmore was standing at the window looking out at the yard. She was dressed, her hair pinned up neatly. She turned when she heard him. "Creek's still up," she said. "I checked at first light." "You went outside?" "Just to the gate. I wanted to see." She poured him a cup of coffee without being asked, and set it on the table. "I didn't go past the property line." He sat down. He picked up the cup. He noticed without comment that the coffee was the right temperature. The cup had been warmed first, which almost no one did. The detail was so small it was almost invisible. That was what she was like, he was beginning to understand. Small, invisible details. Done without announcement. Done because they were the right thing to do. "The horse," he said. "Fed and watered. I got up at 4. She sat down across from him with her own cup. "He's doing better." "You didn't need to do that." "He's my horse. Of course I did." Elias drank his coffee. She didn't fill the silence with chatter. She drank her coffee and looked out the window. He realized with a slight sense of disorientation that he had not sat at this table in comfortable silence with another person in a very long time. "You mentioned yesterday you could keep accounts," he said. "Yes. My supply ledgers are in the study. The current season and the previous 2. She looked at him, a small question in her expression. "You said you wanted to see if the work was worth the distance," he said. "I figure the accounts will tell you more than I could." She spent the morning in the study. He went out to the ranch. He had work to do, always work to do, and he told himself that was the only reason he felt entirely normal about leaving a woman he barely knew in his house, looking at his financial records. But around mid-morning, when he came back in for a tool, he'd forgotten he stopped in the hallway outside the study. The door was partially open. He could see her at the desk, 3 ledgers open in front of her, a sheet of paper beside her on which she was writing something. Her pen moved quickly, then stopped, then quickly again. He watched her for a moment. She hadn't heard him come in. She was completely absorbed in what she was doing. Her lips moved slightly as she worked through numbers. A small frown line appeared between her eyebrows. Then she turned back 2 pages in the oldest ledger and looked at something, and the frown line deepened. Elias quietly retrieved the tool he'd come for and went back out to the yard. At noon she came to find him at the north fence line. He heard her horse before he saw her, She'd taken one of the barn horses, which he noted with approval rather than irritation. It was practical, not presumptuous. She pulled up beside him. "I found something," she said. He waited. "In your supply accounts from the last 2 winters." She held out the paper she'd been working on. "There's a consistent overpayment on feed deliveries, roughly 12 to 15% above the contract rate. Every 3rd or 4th delivery going back at least 22 months. He took the paper. He looked at it. The numbers were laid out clearly with dates and delivery amounts, and the variance from contracted price marked in a separate column. He felt something cold move through him, not because the number was enormous. In the context of the ranch's operation, 12% on feed was not catastrophic, but because it meant someone had been taking advantage of him, and he had not caught it. His own accounts, his own ledgers, and he had not caught it. "Do you know who handles the deliveries?" she asked. "A man named Greer. He's been supplying this ranch for 6 years. Then either Greer has been billing you incorrectly for 2 years, or someone on your end has been approving the invoices without checking them against the contract rate." She said it without accusation, just clearly, the way you state a problem before you solve it. He folded the paper. He looked at her. "This took you 3 hours to find." "I've been keeping farm accounts since I was 19, she said. "Numbers talk if you know how to listen to them." He folded the paper again and put it in his coat pocket. "How much did you and your husband have in your farm account when he died?" he asked. It was a blunt question. He knew it. He didn't take it back. She held his gaze. $41. And a horse. He nodded. He looked out at the fence line. "What did Gerald Farrow say about me?" he asked. "Before you came here." She looked at him with a slight surprise. "I don't know a Gerald Farrow." "You heard about this ranch from someone. From a woman named Mary Sutton in Laramie. She takes in mending, and she's worked for 3 of the ranching families in the area. She said Blackwood Ranch was the only one that paid its workers on time, treated them fairly, and didn't cut corners on quality." She paused. "She also said the owner was stubborn private and too proud by half, but that the work was honest." Elias was quiet for a moment. "She said I was too proud. She said you were too proud by half." Clara's eyes had a faint, very controlled glimmer of something in them. Not quite amusement. Something more careful than that. "I figured that was probably accurate, but I've worked for worse." He almost smiled again. He pulled his horse around. "Creek should be down by tomorrow morning." "I imagine so." "You're welcome to stay tonight." She looked at him evenly. "And the position?" He stopped. He turned back. He looked at her sitting on his barn horse with the autumn plains behind her, her back straight and her expression steady, and he tried to think about it rationally. He needed someone for the household. He had known that for more than a year. And here was someone who had in one morning found an accounting error that had cost him money for nearly 2 years. But that was not the only reason he was about to say what he was going to say. The other reason was simpler and harder to admit. She was the first person who had arrived at this ranch and looked at him first. "We'll talk wages tomorrow," he said. "You can start the following Monday." He turned his horse and rode back toward the barn. Behind him, he heard nothing. No exclamation, no effusive thanks, no performance of gratitude. Just the quiet sound of her horse moving in the other direction. He found himself, to his considerable surprise, looking forward to tomorrow. But something was waiting for him back at the house. He found Hank Doyle on the porch with an expression that Elias recognized immediately, the tight jaw and careful eyes of a man who had news he didn't want to deliver. "What?" Elias said. "A wire came while you were out." Hank held out the paper. "From your mother." Elias took it. He read it once, then again. "Have spoken with Farrow. He tells me you have refused the arrangements. I am sending Miss Eugenia Hartwell in 2 weeks. The daughter of Senator Hartwell of Pennsylvania. You will receive her. This is not a request. Your mother." He stood on the porch with the wire in his hand. Hank said nothing. "Send a reply," Elias said. "What should it say?" Elias was quiet for a long moment. He looked out at the yard at the gate, where less than 24 hours ago, A woman had stood in the rain with a tired horse and 4 words. "I'm looking for work." "Tell her," he said slowly, "that I've already hired a housekeeper." Hank blinked. "Sir." "Tell her the position has been filled, and I'm not receiving visitors this winter." He handed back the paper. "Send it before supper." He went inside. He hung up his coat. He walked to the kitchen where the morning's coffee pot had been cleaned and set back on the shelf, where the table had been wiped down, where everything was exactly as it should be. Not because someone was performing neatness, but because someone had simply quietly done what needed to be done. He stood in his own kitchen for a moment. He thought, "What is happening to you, Elias Blackwood?" He didn't have an answer. He went back to work. That evening, Clara asked him at supper. She had cooked without being asked, using what was in the kitchen, producing something simple and good. She asked him about the ranch, not about the value of it, not about the size of the operation. She asked, what was the hardest year? He looked up from his plate. Nobody had ever asked him that. 4 years ago, he said. Bad winter. Lost 40 head in one storm alone. That spring, the buyer I'd had a contract with for 8 years backed out. I had cattle no buyer and 3 months of debt due. She listened. She didn't fill the space with sympathy. She just listened. What did you do? She asked. Drove 100 head to Cheyenne myself. Sold at a loss. Used it to cover the most urgent debt. Then spent the next year rebuilding the herd and finding new contracts. He paused. It worked, eventually. That's a hard thing to carry alone. Most things worth building are. She looked at him. Is that something your father told you? I was surprised again. No. He would have said something different. He would have said the land will outlast everything, son. Don't carry it. Let it carry you. He paused. He was better at that than I am. You seem to carry it quite well. I seem to. He looked at his plate. I'm not sure it's the same thing. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had settled. Clara put down her fork and looked at the table for a moment. My husband used to say I worked too hard, she said quietly. He said it wasn't a compliment the way he meant it. He meant I had trouble letting people help. She looked up. I think he was right. Elias said nothing, but he thought I know exactly what that means. He didn't say it out loud, but later alone again. In the study, he sat in his father's chair and stared at the fire and thought about a woman who had arrived in a storm looking for work and had somehow in less than 24 hours made him feel more understood than he had felt in years. He told himself that was nothing. He told himself it was just relief at finding competent help. He told himself a lot of things. None of them entirely held up. The creek dropped by morning as he'd expected. Clara Whitmore left after breakfast, riding back toward Laramie to collect her things and settle the last of her business there. She would return on Monday, she said, as agreed. He walked her to the gate. She mounted her horse, much recovered now, head up and moving easily, and turned it toward the road. Elias, she said. He looked up. Thank you for opening the gate last night. She said it simply. Just that. Not everyone would have. He held the gate post. It was a bad storm. It was. She adjusted her reins. I'll see you Monday. She rode down the road. He stood at the gate for a moment after she was out of sight. Then he went back to the barn to start the morning feeding. But the house, when he passed it, did not look the same as it had looked on Wednesday. He couldn't have said exactly why. He walked on. And somewhere down that road, riding toward Laramie with the morning sun at her back, Clara Whitmore was thinking about a man who had opened a gate in a storm, not because he was trying to impress her, not because she was beautiful or wealthy or connected, but simply because it was raining, and she had asked. She had met a great many men in her 32 years. She had never met one who looked at her the way Elias Blackwood looked at her when she talked about numbers. Not like she was a woman, like she was a person. She told herself it was just a job. She told herself that all the way back to Laramie. She came back on Monday. Elias had told himself more than once over the weekend that there was a reasonable chance she wouldn't. People said they would return and then found reasons not to. The road was long. Laramie had other opportunities. The Palmer Ranch was closer. He had prepared himself quietly and without drama for the possibility that Monday morning would arrive and the yard would be empty, and that would be the end of it. But at 7:15, he heard hoofbeats. How was at the barn when she rode in. Same horse, better rested. A second bag tied behind the saddle, not large, but there. She had packed enough to stay. She dismounted before he reached her and began untying the bag herself. "The road north was muddy," she said. "I left earlier than I planned." "I noticed." She looked at him. Something passed across her face, not quite a smile, but close to one. "Good morning, Elias." "Morning?" He took the horse's bridle. "I'll put him up. Hank's wife Martha is in the kitchen. She'll show you where things are kept." Clara lifted her bag. "I'll find my way." He didn't doubt it. She walked to the house and Elias stood there holding her horse's bridle for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, watching the door close behind her. Then he took the horse to the barn and got back to work. That was what he told himself. He was getting back to work. Martha Doyle had been managing the cooking and basic housekeeping at Blackwood Ranch for 11 years. She was 60 years old, sharp as a tack, and not easily impressed by anything or anyone. She had seen every kind of person come through that house. Seasonal workers, cattle buyers, lawyers, 2 attempted thieves and 19 women in succession who had arrived, dressed for a parlor, and left looking like they'd survived a storm. She had her opinions about all of them. When Clara walked into the kitchen that Monday morning, Martha was kneeling in front of the lower cabinet inventorying the dry stores, something she did at the start of every month with the thoroughness of a military quartermaster. Clara set her bag by the door, looked at what Martha was doing, and without a word knelt down on the other side and began reading off the labels from the back of the shelf. Martha stopped. She looked at this woman. "You don't have to do that," Martha said. "I know. But you're counting from the front and missing what's behind." Clara pulled out a tin of dried beans that had been pushed to the very back. "This one's from last spring. It's still good, but it needs to go to the front of the rotation." Martha stared at the tin. She looked at Clara. "You've kept house before," Martha said. 8 years. Clara set the tin on the floor and reached back in for another. "Farm in Kansas. 20 acres, a crew of 6 at harvest, and a husband who believed the pantry managed itself." Martha almost laughed. "They all believe that." "Every one of them," Clara agreed. They finished the inventory together in 40 minutes. Martha had planned to spend 2 hours on it. Afterward, Martha put on coffee and they sat at the kitchen table, and Martha asked, because Martha always asked what she wanted to know, life being too short for anything else. "What are you actually here for?" Clara looked at her evenly. "Work." "There's plenty of work in Laramie." "There's plenty of work here too." "There's also a man here," Martha said. "A wealthy one, a lonely one who has turned away 19 women in the past 3 years, which is the kind of thing people in this county have opinions about." Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She didn't look away. "I heard about the ranch before I heard about the man, and I'm here because I need fair wages for honest work, not because I have any interest in being the 20th name on whatever list you're referring to." Martha studied her. Long pause. "He's not what people think," Martha said finally. "I didn't come here thinking anything," Clara said. "That's rather the point." Martha picked up her own cup. She drank. She set it down. "All right," she said. "I'll show you where the supply ledgers are." What happened in the following 2 weeks happened. The way real change always happens. Not in dramatic announcements, but in accumulated small moments that only revealed their significance in retrospect. Clara took over the household accounts. Within 3 days, she had reorganized the supply ordering system, eliminating duplicate orders that had been costing the ranch roughly $40 a season in unnecessary stock. She presented her findings to Elias on a single sheet of paper. No preamble, no flattery, just the numbers and the proposed changes. He approved them without discussion because there was nothing to discuss. She was right. She also quietly renegotiated the delivery schedule with the local general store in town, securing a better per-unit price on staples, in exchange for committing to a consistent monthly order. The store owner, a man named Bates, who had been dealing with the ranch's erratic ordering for years, agreed immediately. Hank found out about this secondhand from Bates himself when he went to town for fence nails. He came back and told Elias. Elias said, "She didn't mention it." Hank looked at him. "I know. That's going to save us, what, $60–70 a year?" Something like that. Elias thought about that for a moment. "She didn't mention it," he said again, and there was something in his voice that Hank could not entirely interpret, but recognized as significant. "No, sir," Hank said. "She just did it." The ranch hands were a harder audience. There were 7 of them full-time, Hank, Old Pete, Young Daniel, and 4 others, and they had been through enough housekeepers and temporary cooks to have developed the efficient skepticism of men who'd been disappointed regularly. The first morning, Clara sent breakfast out to the bunkhouse at 5:45, 15 minutes earlier than the previous arrangement, because she'd asked Old Pete the day before what time the men were actually working, and he'd told her they started at 6, but usually skipped the full meal because they didn't want to be late. The food arrived hot. There was enough of it. Nobody said anything directly. But Daniel told Pete that evening that the new woman must be all right, at least provisionally. Pete told Daniel that she'd fixed a split seam on his good wool coat without being asked, leaving it folded on the bunkhouse step with no note. Daniel told the others. The others looked at each other. Provisionally, they decided, was probably an understatement. The first real test came at the end of the second week. It was a Thursday, and Elias was in the study after supper reviewing the supplier contracts, including the one for the feed deliveries, which he had pulled out after Clara's discovery, and gone over with the exacting attention of a man who does not enjoy being made a fool of. He had found 3 additional discrepancies. She hadn't caught smaller ones buried deeper in the records. He had the feeling studying them that she had found the obvious ones quickly and left the deeper audit for him to complete. Not because she couldn't do it, but because she understood that there are things a man needs to discover for himself. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. A knock at the study door. "Come in." Clara opened the door and stayed in the doorway. She had a piece of paper in her hand. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "I found something else." He gestured her in. She came to the desk and laid the paper beside the ledger he was reading. The seasonal labor contracts from the last 3 years. The day rate has been consistent, which is correct, but there are signatures on several of the payment receipts that don't match the workers they're credited to. He looked at the paper. He looked at her. Someone signed for wages on behalf of workers who weren't present. 3 instances that I can confirm. There may be more. She pointed to 2 names on the paper. Both of these men are listed in the payroll, but aren't in any of the crew records I can find. Elias was very still. "You're telling me someone on this ranch has been collecting wages for men who don't exist. I'm telling you the record suggests that possibility." She stepped back from the desk. "I thought you should know before I went any further. It's your books, and it's your decision how you want to handle it." He stood up. Clara watched him. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and he said nothing for a long moment, and she was quiet, because she understood without him explaining it, that this was not just a bookkeeping problem. This was someone he trusted, someone who had been in his employ, someone who had been stealing from him carefully and patiently for years. "How much?" he said. "At the current day rate, somewhere between $150 and $200 total." He said nothing. "It's not the money," she said quietly. He turned around. "No, it's not." Their eyes met. There was a quality to his expression that Clara had seen once before on the face of her husband, 3 months before he died, when he finally understood that the man who had held his loan had been manipulating the terms for 2 seasons. The look of a person who has placed trust somewhere carefully and found it misplaced. "I'll talk to Hank in the morning," Elias said. "I'll leave the records on the desk." She picked up the paper and set it neatly on top of the ledger. "Good night, Elias." She was at the door when he said, "Clara." She stopped. "Thank you." She didn't turn around, but he saw her shoulders settle slightly, not with relief, but with something more like recognition, like being seen. "It's what you're paying me for," she said. She left. He stood in the study for a long time after. The morning meeting with Hank was not easy. Hank was not the one stealing. Elias had known that before he sat down. Hank Doyle was the most honest man he'd ever employed, and the idea of Hank taking from the ranch was as inconceivable as the idea of rain falling upward. But Hank was the one responsible for overseeing the payroll records, which meant Hank had missed it. Hank sat in the chair across from the desk with the records in front of him and worked through them slowly, carefully, and in a silence that got heavier with every page he turned. "It's Greer," Hank said finally. Greer, the same feed flyer who'd been overbilling. "He knows the names from making deliveries. He'd know who was on crew and who wasn't." Hank set down the records and looked at the desk, not at Elias. "I should have caught this." "Yes," Elias said. Hank nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. That was one of the things Elias valued most about Hank Doyle. He stood up to his mistakes the same way he stood up to everything else directly. "I'll deal with Greer today," Elias said. "And we're changing the payment verification process. From now on, every payroll receipt needs 2 sign-offs. I'll make sure of it. The second sign-off will be Clara Whitmore." Hank looked up. Elias held his gaze. "She found it. She's the one with the clearest eye for the records. It makes sense. The men will have opinions about that. The men will adjust." He stood up. "Tell Greer I want to see him at 2 o'clock. Don't tell him why." Hank stood. He picked up his hat. He paused at the door. "That woman," he said, not looking back, "is not what I expected." "No," Elias said. "She's not." Greer arrived at 2 o'clock. He was a broad man, red-faced and confident in the way of someone who had not yet realized his luck had run out. He walked into the study with the easy manner of a business acquaintance coming for a routine meeting. He left 20 minutes later, looking considerably smaller. Elias did not raise his voice once. He laid the records on the desk and walked Greer through each discrepancy, each false signature, each inflated delivery invoice, with the steady, methodical precision of a man who has already decided the outcome and is simply completing the necessary steps. Greer tried an order denial minimization, an attempted explanation involving a bookkeeping error, and finally, a half-articulated suggestion that these things happened in every operation, and surely Elias could see his way to— "Stop," Elias said. Greer stopped. "You will return the full amount of the falsified wage payments. You will correct the billing on the feed invoices, and you will not set foot on this property again." He stood up. "If I find any reason to believe this has happened with any other ranch in the valley, I'll be speaking with the sheriff." Greer left. Elias went back to work. That evening at supper, he told Clara what had happened. Briefly, factually. She listened. "Did he give you trouble?" she asked. "He tried." "They always try." She looked at her plate. "My husband had a man like that once. A buyer who shorted the weights on every shipment for 2 years. When we finally confronted him, he cried." She looked up. Actual tears. Greer didn't cry. No. He went red and then white and then he left. Clara picked up her fork. "That's usually worse. The criers feel bad. The ones who go white are just calculating what they can still get away with." Elias looked at her. "You think he'll try something?" "I think men like that don't stop. They just find a different angle." She said it without heat. Just observation. "Watch your feed contract for the next 2 seasons." He filed that away. He was beginning to understand, started filing away, a great many things she said. The moment everything shifted happened on a Friday afternoon in the middle of the 3rd week, and it had nothing to do with accounts or contracts or financial records. Daniel, the youngest ranch hand, had taken a fall from a horse that morning and landed badly on his right shoulder. The local doctor was in Laramie a full 2 hours away, and while the injury wasn't life-threatening, the boy was white with pain and couldn't lift his arm above his chest. Hank had sent one of the other men for the doctor and had settled Daniel in the bunkhouse, but the boy was scared. He was 19 years old, and he'd never broken anything before, and he was trying hard not to show how frightened he was, which was making it worse. Clara appeared at the bunkhouse door 20 minutes after it happened. She came in without being invited and went straight to Daniel. She looked at his shoulder with the careful, detached assessment of someone who'd dealt with farm injuries before. She asked him where it hurt and how it felt, and whether the pain was sharp or dull. And she asked these questions in a tone that was neither panicked nor dismissive, just clear and practical and calm, and that tone alone seemed to help. She sent old Pete for a specific combination of supplies from the kitchen. She fashioned a proper sling that immobilized the shoulder better than the makeshift one Hank had put together. She sat with Daniel for nearly an hour while they waited for the doctor talking to him. Not about the injury, but about everything else. About his family in Nebraska. About what he planned to do with his wages in spring. About whether he'd ever been to Cheyenne. When the doctor arrived and confirmed the shoulder was dislocated rather than broken, and when the doctor reset it, a procedure that made Daniel make a sound no one in the room would repeat. Clara was the person whose arm Daniel grabbed. He was embarrassed about that afterward. He told old Pete he didn't know why he'd done it. Old Pete told him there was nothing to be embarrassed about. That's just what happens, he said, when somebody makes you feel like you're not alone. Daniel thought about that. Elias had watched the whole thing from the bunkhouse doorway. He hadn't gone in. Clara had the situation clearly in hand, and there was no useful role for him to fill. But he stayed in the doorway. He watched her with the boy. He watched the way she handled something difficult and frightening and made it feel, if not easy, then at least manageable, and something he had been telling himself for 3 weeks. Something about this being a professional arrangement, a practical solution, a competent employee doing competent work, that something developed a crack it would not recover from. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about 19 women who had sat at his dinner table and asked about his land. He thought about a woman who had sat at his dinner table and asked about his hardest year. He thought about a woman who had arrived with $41 and a horse and turned his failing accounts into something functional in 3 weeks. He thought about the way she'd looked at him from the doorway of the bunkhouse that afternoon, just a glance checking whether he was there, making sure things were all right. Not the look of someone performing for an audience, just the look of someone checking in. He got up at 3 in the morning and went to the kitchen for water. She was already there. She was sitting at the table with a cup of something warm, her hair down, wearing a plain robe over her nightclothes. She looked up when he came in, and there was a brief moment where neither of them said anything, because neither of them had expected the other. "Can't sleep," she said. "No." He filled a glass from the water pitcher. I keep thinking about the shoulder joint." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "Whether the doctor seated it properly. I've seen a badly set dislocation cause problems for years. You've dealt with dislocations before." 3. 2 horses and 1 hired man who fell off a ladder. She looked at the table. "You learn fast when there's no one else to call." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He did it without thinking. He sat down in the middle of the night in his own kitchen across from a woman he'd known for 3 weeks, and it felt unsettlingly like the most natural thing he'd done in months. "You were married 8 years, he said. "Yes." "What was his name?" She looked up. Something moved across her face. "James." She said it quietly. "James Whitmore. He was from Ohio originally. He never quite got used to the Kansas winters." The faintest trace of something fond in her voice. "He used to say the wind out there was personal, like it had decided specifically to inconvenience him." Elias almost smiled. "What did he do?" Elias asked. "I mean, what kind of man was he?" She thought about it. She didn't rush the answer. "Generous," she said finally. "Sometimes to a fault. He trusted people too easily. He always assumed everyone meant well." A pause. "I wasn't always right about that, but I always thought it was a braver way to live than the alternative." Elias looked at his water glass. "The alternative being, assuming they don't." She looked at him. "Which is faster and easier, but lonelier." The kitchen was very quiet. "Is that what you think I do?" he said. She held his gaze. "I think you've had reasons to." He said nothing. "I'm not criticizing," she said. "I understand it. After James died, I spent about a year assuming the worst of everyone because it was easier than being surprised again." She turned her cup slowly in her hands. "It's a reasonable response to being hurt. It just doesn't work as a permanent position." He looked at her for a long moment. "How did you stop?" he asked. She seemed to think about that seriously. "Someone needed help," she said. "A neighbor woman. Her husband had left her with 3 children and no money and a leaking roof. And I was so busy being careful with myself that I almost walked past her." She looked at him. "I didn't. And helping her was the first time in a year I felt like myself, instead of someone just trying to avoid the next bad thing." The fire in the stove had settled to a low, steady warmth. "James sounds like someone worth missing," Elias said. Her face shifted, very slightly, something real and private in it. "He was," she said. "He was also human and difficult and occasionally infuriating, and I miss all of that too." She looked down at her cup. "People aren't worth missing because they were perfect. They're worth missing because they were real." The silence that followed was the most comfortable silence Elias Blackwood had sat in for as long as he could remember. He stayed another 20 minutes, then he said goodnight. Then he went back to bed. Then he lay there staring at the ceiling again, but for entirely different reasons than before. The next morning, Hank came to him before breakfast. He had a look that Elias was beginning to dread, the tight jaw, the careful eyes. "What now?" Elias said. Hank handed him a letter. "Your mother arrived in Cheyenne last night. She sent a rider this morning." He paused. "She'll be here by noon." Elias stood completely still. "Eleanor Blackwood," Hank said unnecessarily. "I know who my mother is, Hank." "She wired ahead from Cheyenne. She's bringing Miss Hartwell." Elias looked at the letter. He looked at the yard. He thought about a woman in his kitchen at 3 in the morning, talking about a husband named James, who thought the Kansas wind was personal. "Hank," he said. "Sir?" "Tell Martha to set 2 extra places for lunch." He folded the letter. "And tell Clara I need to speak with her before noon." Hank looked at him carefully. "Should I tell her why?" Elias pocketed the letter. "I'll tell her myself," he said. He walked back toward the house, and whatever peace the morning had briefly offered him was gone, replaced by the particular tension of a man who has made one decision quietly and is about to discover what it costs him to hold it. He found Clara in the storage room off the kitchen, taking inventory of the winter supply stock she'd reorganized the week before. She had a small book in one hand and a pencil in the other, and she was counting bags of flour with the focused concentration of someone who genuinely cared whether the number came out right. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. She saw his face. She put the pencil down. "My mother is coming," he said. "She's bringing a woman she wants me to meet. She'll be here around noon." Clara's expression remained steady. "I see. This isn't—" He stopped. He wasn't a man who stumbled over his own words. He found it irritating. "I want you to understand that this isn't something I arranged or agreed to." "You don't need to explain yourself to me," she said. Her voice was even. Carefully even, he thought. "I know I don't," he said. "I'm explaining anyway." She looked at him for a moment. "What would you like me to do?" she asked. "During the visit?" "Nothing different from what you'd normally do." "She'll ask who I am." "You're the housekeeper." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Clara's expression. So small, he might have imagined it. "Of course," she said. She picked up her pencil. She went back to counting flour. Elias stood in the doorway one moment longer. Then he went to prepare for his mother. Eleanor Blackwood arrived at 11:55. She arrived the way she always arrived, efficiently, with purpose, and about 5 minutes earlier than anyone expected her. She was 61 years old, still sharp-featured and direct in the manner of a woman who had raised a son alone after losing a husband, and had decided somewhere along the way that life was too short for ambiguity. She stepped out of the carriage and looked at her son and said, "You look tired." "Hello, Mother. You've lost weight." "I haven't." "You look like you've lost weight." She embraced him briefly, efficiently, the way she did everything. Then she turned. "Eugenia, come meet my son." Miss Eugenia Hartwell was 28 years old, fair-haired, and dressed beautifully. She was the kind of woman who moved carefully, as if aware at all times of being observed. She smiled at Elias with the practiced warmth of someone who had been prepared for this moment. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "your mother has told me so much about you." "Has she?" Elias said. Eleanor gave him a look that said, "Behave yourself." He behaved himself. Lunch was served in the dining room. Martha and Clara had prepared it together, and it was good, simple, well-made, the kind of food that didn't announce itself, but delivered consistently. The kind Clara made. Eleanor noticed. She noticed most things. Halfway through the meal, when Eugenia was asking Elias about the spring calving schedule in the tone of someone who had been coached to ask about the spring calving schedule. Eleanor looked toward the kitchen door and said, "Who is cooking?" "The housekeeper," Elias said. "Which housekeeper? Martha never made soup like this." "A new hire. She started 3 weeks ago." Eleanor set down her spoon. She looked at her son with an expression he knew very well, the expression of a woman assembling information. "New hire," she repeated. "Yes. A woman. That's generally what housekeeper refers to." Eleanor picked up her spoon again. She said nothing else about it. But for the rest of the meal, Elias was aware of his mother's attention, in the precise, uncomfortable way one is always aware of Eleanor Blackwood's attention, when she has decided she wants to understand something. After lunch, Eleanor asked to see the house files, the supply records in their new system. "This is different," she said. Clara reorganized the records. "Clara." Eleanor said the name once to hear it. "Is she good?" "She's exceptional." Eleanor turned. She looked at him with that clear, direct gaze that had never in his life failed to make him feel slightly transparent. "Elias," she said. "Mother. Is there something I should know?" He held her gaze. "She's the housekeeper. She's good at her job. That's the end of it." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Then she said, "Of course." She went back to the dining room to sit with Eugenia. And Elias stood alone in his reorganized study and looked at the ledgers that weren't his system, and the supply records that weren't his method, and the quietly accumulated evidence of 3 weeks of another person's careful attention to his life. He stood there. He thought Clara. And the word landed differently than it had 3 weeks ago. He didn't know what to do about that. He went back to his guests, but he thought about it the rest of the afternoon. And that night, long after Eleanor and Eugenia had retired to the guest rooms, he sat alone in the kitchen, his kitchen that smelled faintly now of the herbs Clara had hung to dry, and he admitted to himself quietly, and without any particular fanfare, that the 19th rejection and all the careful walls he'd built around himself might not after all be as permanent as he'd intended. He just had no idea yet what came next. And tomorrow, his mother was going to be watching him with those clear, sharp eyes of hers. And Clara was going to be in this house. And Elias Blackwood, for the first time in a very long time, had absolutely no plan. Eleanor Blackwood did not leave the next morning. Elias had assumed she would. His mother was a woman with a schedule, a social calendar, and a return carriage already booked for Tuesday. She did not linger. She arrived, accomplished what she came to accomplish, and departed with the efficiency of someone who had never wasted a day in her life. But Tuesday morning came, and Eleanor was at the breakfast table at 6 o'clock, dressed and alert, with no mention of leaving. Elias sat down across from her. "I thought you had engagements in Cheyenne," he said. "I rescheduled." She poured her own coffee. "Eugenia is a flexible traveler." "Mother." The soup was extraordinary, by the way. She did not look up from her cup. "I don't know what she put in it, but it was the best thing I've eaten since I left Philadelphia. I'd like the recipe." "She won't give it to you." Eleanor looked up. "Excuse me. She doesn't write her recipes down. She cooks from memory." He picked up his fork. "She told Martha it's because a recipe written down stops being yours." Eleanor stared at him. He ate his breakfast. "You've had several conversations with her," Eleanor said. It was not a question. "She works in this house. You know how she thinks about recipes." She mentioned it. Eleanor set her cup down with a precise, deliberate motion. "Elias." Eleanor. She looked at him with the expression she had used on him since he was 8 years old. The one that communicated without a word that she was not fooled, and he was not as subtle as he believed. "I'm going to stay through Thursday," she said, "to make sure Eugenia has a fair opportunity. She's had a fair opportunity. One lunch is not a fair opportunity. 19 lunches wouldn't change anything," he said. And the moment he said it, the way he said it, too fast, too certain, he saw something move across his mother's face that he did not like at all. She picked up her cup again. "We'll see," she said pleasantly. She was going to be a problem. Clara, to her considerable credit, behaved for the next 2 days, as though Eleanor Blackwood and Eugenia Hartwell were simply guests to be accommodated, neither more nor less significant than anyone else who came through the house. She cooked. She managed the household. She kept the supply records and met with Hank about the revised payroll verification process, and checked on Daniel's shoulder every morning with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had appointed herself responsible for his recovery without making any announcement about it. She did not avoid Eugenia. She did not perform warmth toward her either. When they crossed paths in the hallway in the kitchen once at the barn door, Clara was courteous, brief, and genuinely unreadable, which Elias thought was probably harder to maintain than it looked. Eugenia, for her part, watched Clara with the particular attention of a young woman who has been trained to assess competitors and has correctly identified one. On Wednesday afternoon, Elias came in from the north pasture to find Eugenia alone in the kitchen, standing at the counter with Clara's household ledger open in front of her. He stopped in the doorway. Eugenia looked up. She did not look embarrassed. "I was curious about how the house accounts are kept," she said. "It's quite organized." "It is. She does all of this herself, the inventory, the supplier records, the payroll cross-reference." "Yes." Eugenia looked back at the ledger. "She's very thorough." "She is." A pause. "She's not what I expected," Eugenia said. She said it quietly, without apparent calculation, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Elias thought he was hearing something genuine. "What did you expect?" he said. Eugenia closed the ledger carefully. She looked at him. She was a perceptive woman, he realized. She had been so carefully presented over 2 days that he had not paid enough attention to what was underneath the presentation. "I expected someone older," she said. "Or someone who needed the position more obviously." She set her hand on top of the closed ledger. "She doesn't need this position, Mr. Blackwood. Not the way I was told she might." He said nothing. Eugenia nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "I think we both know how this is going to resolve," she said. And she walked out of the kitchen with a dignity that made Elias feel unexpectedly something close to respect. He stood there for a moment. Then he went to find his mother. He found her in the yard talking to Hank, which meant she had been asking questions about the ranch operation, which was Eleanor's version of due diligence. He waited until Hank excused himself. "Eugenia is leaving tomorrow," Elias said. Eleanor looked at him. "She told you that?" "Not in those words." His mother was quiet for a moment. She looked out at the barn. "She's a good woman, Elias." "I believe that." "She would have been." "I know, Mother. I just want you to be." "I know." He stood beside her. He was a foot taller than her had been since he was 15, and there were still moments when he felt like a child in her presence. Not diminished, just known. "I'm not unhappy. I want you to understand that. I'm not lonely in the way you're afraid of." Eleanor looked at him carefully. "What way are you afraid of?" He thought about 3 o'clock in the morning, and a cup of something warm, and a woman who said people are worth missing because they were real. "I'm working on it," he said. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Then she did something she did very rarely. She reached up and put her hand briefly against his face, the gesture of a mother who remembers a boy, and then she let her hand drop and looked back at the barn. "All right," she said. "All right. I'll stop sending Pharaoh's recommendations. She straightened. But I want a letter every month. A real one, not 2 lines about the cattle count. I can do that. And if something changes, you'll be the second to know. She looked at him sharply. Second. He walked back toward the house. Behind him, he heard his mother make a sound that was somewhere between exasperation and something warmer. It was the closest Eleanor Blackwood came to laughing. Eleanor and Eugenia left Thursday morning. The farewell was brief and correct. Eugenia shook Elias's hand, said it had been a pleasure, and meant it, which he appreciated. Eleanor embraced him, told him he still looked like he'd lost weight, and climbed into the carriage. As the carriage pulled out of the yard, Elias stood at the gate. He heard the kitchen door open behind him. "They're gone," Clara said. "They're gone." A pause. "Good soup," she said. He turned around. She was leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed, and there was something in her expression that was not quite amusement, and not quite relief, but was some combination of the two. "My mother wants the recipe," he said. "I know. She asked me directly." "What did you tell her?" "I told her it was salt pork and winter vegetables, and 30 years of practice, and you can't put that in a recipe card." She looked at him steadily. "She told me I was insufferably sensible." "She means that as a compliment." "I gathered." Clara unfolded her arms. "The supply delivery is coming at 2. I'll be in the kitchen if Hank needs me for the paperwork." She went back inside. Elias stood at the gate a moment longer. Then he allowed himself privately, and without announcement, one small breath of something that felt remarkably like relief. November arrived hard. The sky changed overnight, that flat pewter quality that old Pete had been predicting since mid-October. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 2 days, and the wind coming off the northern range had a character to it that the experienced men on the crew recognized without needing to discuss. This was not going to be an ordinary winter. Elias pushed the fence reinforcement work on the North Range, adding 2 extra men to the rotation. He ordered additional feed stores beyond what Clara had already calculated, and when he told her the new numbers, she went back to the supply ledger without comment and recalculated the storage requirements and the budget adjustment, and had the revised figures on his desk by the following morning. He didn't ask her to do it that fast. She just did. The crew could feel the pressure of the season building. Conversations at the bunkhouse table were shorter and more practical. Old Pete started talking about the winter of '81, which was the way he always introduced a story meant to prepare younger men for something difficult without frightening them directly. Young Daniel, his shoulder 3 weeks healed and his arm back to full strength, had started following old Pete's example in small ways, arriving early, working quietly, not complaining. Clara had noticed this. She'd told Elias one morning offhandedly that the boy had good instincts and would be a strong ranch hand in a few years if someone continued to invest in him. Elias had started giving Daniel more responsibility the following week. He hadn't told Clara that's why, but she had noticed. He was certain she'd noticed. She simply didn't say anything. They had developed, without negotiating it, a way of operating alongside each other that had its own quiet logic. She did not need to be told twice. He did not need to explain his reasons. She brought problems to him with possible solutions already considered. He made decisions and trusted her to implement them without being checked on. It was, Elias thought, in the increasingly rare moments when he allowed himself to think about it directly, the most functional working relationship he had ever had. He told himself firmly that was what it was. He was not always successful. The storm arrived on the first Saturday of November. It came faster than any of them had anticipated. The morning had been cold but clear, and Elias had taken 2 of the men to check the creek crossing on the south boundary, which had been running high since the October rains. They were 2 miles from the ranch house when the sky changed. Not gradually. Suddenly. Old Pete would say afterward that he'd seen storms come fast before, but this one moved like it had somewhere to be. The temperature dropped 4 degrees in under an hour. The wind shifted north. And then the snow began, not the tentative early season flurries that announced themselves politely, but heavy driving immediate snow, the kind that cuts visibility to 50 yards in 15 minutes. They rode back hard. By the time they reached the barn, the yard was already white. Hank met them at the barn door. He had a look on his face that Elias had seen before. Not panic. Hank didn't panic, but the controlled urgency of a man who has already identified a serious problem. "The north fence," Hank said. "Section between the upper pasture and the ridge. Rideout checked it this morning, said there was a weak post. I sent him back out to reinforce it 2 hours ago. And Rideout isn't back yet, and I just got a count from the upper pasture." Hank paused. "We're short 40 head." Elias went still. The snow was already coming sideways. 40 cattle in an open blizzard on the North Range with a failed fence section meant 40 cattle drifting into the broken country above the ridge, which meant ice ravines and the kind of terrain that swallowed animals in good weather and killed them in bad. "How many men can we put together?" Elias said. "6. 2 are out checking the south boundary. I can't reach them in this." "6 is enough. Get them saddled." Elias was already moving. "Tell old Pete to stay with Daniel and hold the bunkhouse. I don't want the younger men out in this." "What about Rideout?" "We'll find him on the way." He was pulling his heaviest coat from the hook by the barn door when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Clara was standing in the barn entrance. She was already wearing her riding coat. She had a coil of rope over one shoulder and her gloves on. "No," he said immediately. "I can ride," she said. "I know you can ride." "No. You're 6 men short a full coverage sweep in that terrain. 7 makes a difference." "Clara, I know that ridge." She said it with the flat certainty of someone who has done their research and is not guessing. "I rode it last week when I was checking the eastern fence with Hank. I know where the low spots are and where the drifts form. You don't have time to argue with me." He looked at her. The snow was already accumulating on her shoulders. "You understand what this storm is," he said. "Yes. If something happens out there, something will definitely happen to 40 cattle if we stand here discussing this." She held his gaze. "Let me help." There were 4 seconds of the kind of silence that only exists when one person is deciding whether to trust another with something that matters. "Stay on my left," he said. "Don't go more than 30 yards from the nearest rider." "Understood." "If the visibility drops below 20 yards, you pull back to the last marker post and wait. No exceptions." "No exceptions," she said. He handed her an extra lead rope from the barn wall. "Let's go," he said. The North Range in a blizzard is not a place where heroism happens the way it does in stories. There is no glory in it. There is only cold and noise, and the particular disorientation of moving through a world where all the reference points have been erased. The snow comes from every direction. Your horse moves beneath you with the stiff-legged care of an animal that knows the ground has become unreliable. Your hands function, but not well. Your face stops feeling like your own within 20 minutes. The 6 ranch hands and Elias spread across the northern approach to the ridge and pushed forward in a line close enough to keep each other in sight, far enough to cover ground. Clara rode his left as instructed. She did not talk. She watched the terrain the way a person watches something they have made an effort to memorize, and 3 times in the first 40 minutes she called out direction adjustments that proved correct twice, finding shallow crossings through the drifting snow, once identifying a gap in the rock formation to the east that would have sent the sweep line off course into a dead end. Hank, riding to Elias's right, leaned over once and said low enough that only Elias could hear, "She's reading the land." Elias didn't respond. I was watching her. He was watching the way she held herself in the saddle in deteriorating conditions, not tense, not fighting the horse working with it. The way an experienced rider does. He had spent 3 years looking at women who had arrived at his ranch to impress him. He had never once seen anything that looked like this. They found Rideout first. He was on the eastern edge of the upper pasture, his horse standing with its head down, Rideout dismounted and crouching behind the animal, using it as a windbreak. He was cold, but functional. His hands had gotten wet, fixing the fence post, and he'd lost feeling in 2 fingers on his right hand. Clara was off her horse and at Rideout's side before anyone else had fully stopped. She took his right hand, pulled off his wet glove, pressed both her hands around his, and held them there. She told him to keep moving his fingers. She told him to keep talking. It didn't matter what about just keep talking. Rideout, who was 24 years old and had never in his life needed someone to hold his hands, talked. He talked about his mother's kitchen in Missouri, and a dog he'd had as a boy, and the way ice fishing worked on a river he knew as a child, and Clara held his hands and said yes, and keep going. And then she looked up at one of the other riders and said without raising her voice, "Take him back. Get him to the stove. The fingers will recover, but they need warmth in the next hour." The rider took Rideout. They were 5 now, plus Clara. The cattle took another 90 minutes to find. They found them in 2 groups, a larger cluster of 32 that had drifted together against a rock outcropping on the upper ridge, and a scattered group of 8 that Elias found with Clara, while Hank and the others worked the larger group. The 8 were the problem. They had gone deeper than expected further north along the ridge edge, where the ground dropped away in a series of shallow ledges. Getting them turned and moving south without spooking them over the ledge edge required patience and positioning and a steady nerve, because a spooked cow on a snow-covered ledge does not give you a second chance. Elias worked the left side. Clara worked the right. They didn't speak. There was no need to. He moved. She adjusted. She moved. He countered. The cattle, reading the pressure from both sides, began slowly, reluctantly, with the particular stubbornness of animals that have decided they are comfortable where they are to move. 12 minutes of that. 12 minutes of cold and concentration, and 2 people working together in complete silence. And then the 8 cattle were moving south, and Elias exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. That was when Clara's horse went down. He did not see it happen directly. He heard the sound, a sharp wrong sound, and turned, and her horse was down on one knee on a patch of ice that had been hidden under 3 inches of fresh snow, and Clara had gone over the animal's left shoulder into the snow. He was off his horse before his mind had fully processed what he was seeing. He crossed the distance between them, 15 yards, maybe 20, at a speed that had nothing to do with rational decision-making, and everything to do with something that bypassed thought entirely. She was already pushing herself up when he reached her. "I'm all right," she said. He crouched beside her. His hands were on her shoulders before he knew he'd put them there. "Don't move. Just wait a moment." The horse. "Hank will get the horse." He could hear Hank, already calm, efficient, already at the animal's head. "Clara, look at me." She looked at him. Her face was white with cold, and there was snow in her hair, and she was breathing hard, and she looked at him with those direct dark eyes of hers, and said again, "I'm all right, Elias." He was close enough that he could see exactly what was in her eyes. Not fear. Not pain. She would tell him later that she'd landed on her arm, and the coat had cushioned most of it. She was looking at him with the careful attention of someone who has just noticed something significant. He thought with the specific clarity that sometimes arrives in the middle of emergencies that he was probably looking at her the same way. He stood up. He helped her to her feet. He kept his hand on her arm, the uninjured one, for 3 seconds longer than was strictly necessary, and then he let go, and they both turned back to the cattle, and neither of them said anything. But something had happened. On a snow-covered ridge in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard, something had shifted between them in the space of about 30 seconds, and both of them knew it, and both of them were going to spend considerable energy in the next few hours pretending they didn't. They got all 40 cattle back. It took another 40 minutes after Clara's fall, working in near whiteout conditions, with the temperature still dropping, but they got them all 40, including a young heifer that had wedged herself behind a rock formation and had to be physically talked out of it, which Elias did, while Clara held the rope and Hank stood by swearing quietly under his breath. When they came through the gate, the ranch hands left in the bunkhouse came out and took the horses without being asked. Old Pete took one look at the group and disappeared into the cookhouse and came back with a tray of tin cups full of something hot. Daniel, still a step slower than he wanted to be, with his recovering shoulder, held Clara's horse while she dismounted. "You okay?" he said. "Better than the cattle." She patted the horse's neck. "He's fine too, just slipped. I heard you went over." For about 2 seconds. She took the cup old Pete offered. "Don't make it a story." "It's already a story," Daniel said with the helpless candor of someone who is 19 and does not yet know how to be diplomatic. Clara looked at him. He winced. "Sorry," he said. "Don't be." She drank from the cup. "Just tell it accurately." He grinned. She walked toward the house. Elias found her in the kitchen 20 minutes later, standing at the stove with her wet coat hung by the door, warming her hands over the burner. Her left sleeve was pushed up, and there was a bruise developing on her forearm where she'd landed. He came in and looked at the bruise. He didn't say anything about it. "All 40 back," he said. "I know. Hank told me." "Rideout's hands are okay." "I know. Daniel told me." She lowered her sleeve. "Is your horse all right?" "Yes. He's been through worse." "Good." She turned to face him fully. The kitchen was warm, and the rest of the house was quiet, and outside the storm was still going muffled now at a distance. "You're not going to say it, are you?" He looked at her. "Say what?" "Whatever you almost said on the ridge." The silence stretched. Elias looked at the stove. He was not a man who avoided things. He had built his life on not avoiding things. He had faced bad winters and worse debt and the slow erosion of trust and 19 very careful disappointments without flinching. He found at this particular moment that he was not certain he was ready. "No," he said finally. "Not tonight." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Just once. The nod of someone who understands and is not wounded by it. "Go get dry," she said. "I'll have food ready in an hour." He went. He walked down the hallway and up the stairs, and he stood in his room for a long moment with his back against the closed door, and he thought about a woman who had ridden into a blizzard without being asked who had found the cattle and managed the terrain and held a frightened young man's hands and gone over her horse's shoulder onto a frozen ridge and gotten back up with snow in her hair and said, "I'm all right," like it was the most unremarkable thing in the world. He thought about standing on that ridge in the snow with his hands on her shoulders. He thought, "There is nothing about this that is simple." He changed his clothes. He went back downstairs. He ate the meal she'd made, something with the remaining provisions from the winter stock, simple and warm and exactly right, and they sat at the table and talked about Rideout's hands and the cattle count and what the north fence would need when the storm broke. Practical things. Real things. He didn't say what he'd almost said on the ridge. But Clara, he noticed, stopped using the word housekeeper when she referred to herself. It was a small thing, almost invisible. She used his name more often too. Small things. Real things. The storm raged outside all night, and the house held against it warm and intact, and Elias lay awake in the dark and thought about the specific wait of 30 seconds on a snow-covered ridge and knew with the certainty of a man who has been honest with himself for 36 years and knows what honesty feels like, that what was happening to him was not nothing. It had not been nothing for a while, and whatever he was going to do about it was going to require the most careful honesty he had ever managed, because this was not a woman who could be handled carelessly. This was not a woman who would forgive a half-truth. This was Clara Whitmore, who had arrived with $41 and a horse and changed his household and found his thief and ridden into his blizzard and gotten back up off a frozen ridge with snow in her hair. And he was going to have to be worthy of that. I was not yet sure he knew how. But he was, for the first time since the 19th letter had burned in the fireplace, willing to try. The storm broke on Sunday morning. Elias knew it before he opened his eyes. There was a quality to the silence that only exists after a serious storm has exhausted itself. A completeness, a stillness that feels earned rather than accidental. He lay in the dark for a moment and listened to it. Then he got up. The damage assessment took most of the morning. 3 fence sections down on the north range, 2 on the eastern boundary, a section of barn roof on the smaller outbuilding that would need temporary repair before the next weather system arrived. The cattle were intact, all 40 accounted for, still slightly unsettled, but physically sound. Rideout's fingers had recovered full sensation by Saturday night. Daniel had helped with the morning feeding using both arms without complaint. The ranch had come through. Elias stood in the yard after the first assessment walk and looked at what he had built, what his father had started, and he had rebuilt from almost nothing 4 years ago, when $40 had seemed like an impossible distance between debt and survival, and he felt the particular satisfaction of a man whose preparation has proven adequate. Then he went inside to tell Clara. She was already in the study with the ledger open, calculating the cost of the fence repair materials she'd clearly already known would be needed. She had a list beside her: timber dimensions, hardware quantities, estimated labor hours, written in her clear, practical handwriting. She looked up when he came in. 3 sections north, 2 east, he said. She looked at her list. I estimated 4 north. We got lucky. She turned the paper toward him. Supply costs for repair based on current contract rates. I left the labor calculation for you because it depends on how you want to schedule it. He took the paper. He looked at it. You did this morning, he said. I did it last night, while you were sleeping. She said it without any particular significance, just factual. He looked at her. Clara, he said. She waited. He had rehearsed this. Or rather, he was not a man who rehearsed things, but he had spent 2 days since the ridge thinking about what he wanted to say and how to say it without making it sound like something it wasn't. Without making it sound like 19 other conversations he'd had with 19 other women at this same desk. He set the paper down. He said, I owe you something I haven't said directly. She was still. Something in her expression became careful. Not closed, just careful. You don't owe me. Let me finish. He wasn't sharp about it, but he was firm. She stopped. You've been in this house for 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, you found an accounting fraud. I'd been blind to for 2 years, reorganized a supply system that's saving us money every month, managed a household that has been running on half its capacity since before you arrived, held a frightened boy's hands through a doctor's visit, rode into a blizzard you didn't have to ride into, and produced a damage assessment report while I was asleep. He paused. And I have paid you the agreed wages and otherwise treated you like the situation was simply professional. She said nothing. It isn't, he said. Simply professional. The room was very quiet. Clara looked at the desk. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the list she had made last night while he was sleeping. Then she looked at him. Elias, she said, be careful. I'm not being careful, he said. I've been careful for 3 years. I'm finished being careful. That's not what I mean. She folded her hands on the desk. I mean, be careful about what this is, because I am not the 19th woman who walked through your door. I didn't come here for this. And if this... She paused, choosing the word deliberately. If this is gratitude or loneliness, or the particular feeling that comes after surviving something difficult together, then I need you to know that before either of us says anything that can't be unsaid. He looked at her for a long moment. Is that what you think it is? He said. She met his eyes. I don't know what I think it is. That's the problem. Then we're in the same position. We are not in the same position, she said, and there was a sharpness in her voice he hadn't heard before. You are a man with 4,000 acres and a family name and every reason in the world to wait until you're certain. I am a widow with $41 to my name when I arrived here, who works in your house, who has nowhere else to go if this becomes something it shouldn't be. She looked at him steadily. The positions are not the same. The words landed. He let them land. He did not flinch from them, and he did not argue with them, because they were accurate, and she deserved for him to know he understood that. You're right, he said. She waited. The positions aren't the same, he said. And I'm not asking you to pretend they are. I'm asking you. He stopped. He started again. I'm asking you to tell me if what I'm feeling is something you'd be willing to consider. Not decide. Not commit to. Just consider. Clara looked at him for a very long time. Outside, someone was moving through the yard. The quiet sounds of a ranch resuming after a storm horse's voices, the distant sound of Hank directing the fence crew. I've been considering it, she said finally, since the night you opened the gate. Something shifted in Elias Blackwood's chest, something that had been held in a certain careful position for a very long time. All right, he said. All right, she said. They looked at each other across the desk. I'm going to finish this assessment, she said. You have a fence crew that needs direction. He picked up his coat. He stopped at the door. Clara. Yes. Thank you for telling me the truth. She picked up her pencil. "It's what you're paying me for," she said, and this time there was something in her voice that was unmistakably warm. He went out to the fence crew. He did not stop smiling for the better part of an hour. Hank noticed. He said nothing, but he noticed. Metag. What followed was not simple. Nothing about two people who have both been shaped by loss and work, and the particular stubbornness that comes from surviving things alone. Nothing about two people like that is ever simple. They did not suddenly become easy with each other. They did not have a conversation that resolved everything. Real things do not work that way. What changed was something more subtle and more durable. A permission. An acknowledgement that what was between them was real and worth treating carefully. Elias started leaving the study door open in the evenings. It was a small thing, almost invisible. Before he had worked with the door closed, the study was his private space, the place he retreated to, the room that meant, "I am not available." Now the door stood open, and Clara passing in the hallway would sometimes stop, and sometimes she came in, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they just occupied the same space in the way of two people who have run out of the need to fill silence with performance. She told him about Kansas, about the farm, about James, about the year after he died, when she'd sold the livestock piece by piece, because there was no other way to cover the debts, and how the last animal she'd sold had been the milking cow, and how she'd cried about that cow, in a way she hadn't cried about almost anything else, because the cow was the last thing that connected her to the life she'd built, and she hadn't been ready to admit it was over. He told her about the 2 years of rebuilding, about the decisions he'd made at 3 in the morning that he still wasn't sure were right, about the worker he'd had to let go, a man who'd been with the ranch for 11 years because the finances demanded it, and how he still thought about that. They did not tell each other everything at once. They told each other things in pieces, the way trust is actually built gradually over a series of small risks, each one testing whether the other person handles what they've been given with care. They were both careful. They were both underneath the carefulness afraid. The first person to say anything direct was Martha. This was not surprising. Martha Doyle had been saying direct things for 60 years and had no intention of stopping. She found Elias in the barn on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the storm, and she said without preamble, "Are you going to do something about this or not?" He looked up from the harness he was repairing. "About what?" Martha gave him the look she reserved for people who were being deliberately obtuse. "About the woman in your kitchen who reorganized your entire household and rode into a blizzard and is clearly—" She stopped herself, recalibrated, and said more carefully, "who is clearly not going anywhere, and who you clearly—" Another stop. "Elias, don't make me say it plainly." "Then don't say it. Someone has to." She put her hands on her hips. "I have watched you for 11 years. I watched those 19 women come through this house, and I am telling you as plainly as I know how, that what is happening right now in this house is different. Anyone with eyes can see it." He set down the harness. "Martha," he said, "don't Martha me." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I know," he said again. "I'm working on it." Martha studied him for a long moment. Then she uncrossed her arms and said, "She won't wait forever." "I know that too. She's proud, not in the foolish way, in the real way, the kind of proud that leaves rather than beg." He looked at her. "Is she saying anything to you?" "No." Martha picked up her basket. "She never says anything. That's how I know it's serious." She walked to the barn door. "Fix the harness, Elias, and fix the other thing. In that order if you need to, but fix them both." She left. He sat in the barn with the harness for another 20 minutes. Then he went inside. The letter from James Whitmore's creditor arrived on a Thursday. It was addressed to Clara, forwarded through the Laramie post office. Elias saw it on the hall table. He wasn't reading it. He simply saw the return address, and the address told him enough. He left it for her. That evening she came to him in the study. She stood in the doorway with the opened letter in her hand, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who has been reminded at an inconvenient moment of the full weight of where they came from. "James had a remaining debt I thought was settled," she said. The creditor is calling it in." "How much?" she told him. It wasn't enormous. It was not a number that would have alarmed Elias on a supply bill. But he watched Clara's face as she said it, and he understood that to her, it was not a supply bill number. It was the number that stood between her and the word free. "I have most of it saved from the wages," she said. "Not all of it. I may need to arrange a payment schedule with the creditor. It will take a few months." She said it matter-of-factly, without asking for anything, the way she always said difficult things. Elias was quiet for a moment. No. Fast and absolute. She said it before he finished the sentence. "I'm not asking." "I know you're not asking. I'm offering." "The answer is no." She looked at him with something fierce and clear in her expression. "I have managed James's debts myself for 2 years without asking anyone for help, and I will manage this one the same way. That's not pride for its own sake. That's I need to come to whatever this is between us as a person, not as someone you rescued." She paused. "Do you understand the difference?" He did. I understood it in the way that a man understands something that reorders his thinking, not just about this situation, but about something larger. About what it meant to respect someone, not by solving their problems, but by trusting their capacity to solve them. "Yes," he said. "I understand." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "Thank you for not arguing." "I'm recording that for future reference," he said. "In case there comes a time when you claim I never listen." Something broke open in her face, then not quite a laugh, but close and warmer than anything he'd seen before, and it lasted only a second before she composed herself, but he had seen it. He kept it. The second person to say something direct was Old Pete. This was more surprising. Old Pete was not a man given to personal conversation. He had been working cattle ranches since before Elias was born, and he operated on the principle that a man's private life was his own weather system, and you kept your assessment of it to yourself, unless the flooding was getting into the bunkhouse. He found Elias on the north fence line, a week after the letter, on a clear morning when the cold had settled into something steady and bearable. He rode alongside without being invited. He looked at the fence. He looked at the horizon. Then he said, "You know what I've noticed about that woman?" Elias kept writing. "I'm sure you'll tell me. She asks about the men." Pete kept his eyes forward. "Not their work, about them. She asked Daniel about his family in Nebraska. She asked right out what he wanted to do, eventually not here, not ranching specifically, just generally with his life." A pause. "She asked me what the worst winter I'd ever worked was, and then she actually listened to the whole answer, which took 40 minutes. Elias said nothing. "Most people," Pete said, "ask a question like that, and they're waiting for you to finish so they can say something. She was actually listening." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm 64 years old, and I've worked for a lot of people, and I can count on one hand the ones who actually listened when someone who didn't matter to them was talking." "She matters," Elias said. Pete looked at him sidelong. "I know that. The men know that. The men have known for about a month." Pete adjusted his reins. "I'm telling you because I didn't know if you knew that we knew, and that we think you'd be a fool not to." Elias looked at the fence line ahead. "I'm working on it," he said. Pete made a sound that was the old man's version of "then work faster." The moment. Elias finally understood what he needed to do came not from a conversation, but from a single unremarkable morning. He came downstairs at 5:30 and found Clara already at the table with coffee and the supply ledger open, the way he'd found her dozens of times now. But this morning, before she heard him, he stood in the doorway and watched her. She was reading a column of figures and making a small note in the margin, and then she stopped and looked at the window, not looking at anything in particular, just the unfocused look of someone whose mind has paused between tasks, and in that unguarded moment, with no one watching and nothing to perform, and no reason to be anything other than what she was, she looked peaceful was the word. Not happy in a performed way. Not content in a soft way. Peaceful in the way of a person who is exactly where they are, doing exactly what they do without apology or ambition, just present. He thought about 19 women who had sat at this table. He thought about the specific careful calculation he had seen on every one of their faces. And he thought about a woman who looked out a window at 5:30 in the morning with a column of figures in front of her and looked like that. He walked into the kitchen. She looked up. "Coffee's ready," she said. "I know." He sat down across from her. He did not pick up the coffee. She looked at him. He said, "I have something I want to say." She set down her pencil. He had thought about this. He had thought about it with the same methodical attention he brought to difficult financial decisions or complex operational problems. He had thought about what he wanted and why he wanted it and what it would cost and whether it was right. He had done this the way he did everything important, slowly, thoroughly, without shortcuts. "I am not going to make a speech," he said, "because you are not a woman who wants a speech, and I am not a man who makes them." "No," she agreed. "I have been alone in this house for a long time," he said. "Not because I couldn't find someone, because I couldn't find someone who saw this place as a life instead of a prize, who saw me as a person instead of a position." He looked at her. "You walked through that gate in the rain and you asked for work. You didn't ask for anything I have. You asked for the chance to contribute something." He paused. "I have been paying you wages for 6 weeks, and I have been underpaying you every single day, not in money." She was very still. "I am not asking you to give up what you've built," he said. "Your independence, your competence, the fact that you settle your own debts and make your own decisions. I am not asking to take any of that. I want to ask." He stopped. He started again. "I want to know if you would stay, not as the housekeeper, not as the woman who manages my accounts." He held her gaze. "I want to know if you'd stay as yourself, just as yourself, here, with me." The kitchen was completely silent. Clara looked at the ledger. She looked at the window. She looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked at him. "You understand," she said carefully, "that I will still tell you when you're wrong. I'm counting on it. And that I will manage my own finances, including the Whitmore debt, on my own schedule." "Understood. And that I will not be introduced to people as a woman who needs taking care of, because I have never needed taking care of, and I don't intend to start." "I would not introduce you that way." He looked at her steadily. "I would introduce you as the person who rode into a blizzard and found 40 cattle, and then got back up off a frozen ridge and said she was fine." Something moved through Clara Whitmore's expression. Something large and real and briefly unguarded, the kind of thing a person can't manufacture and can't quite hide. She picked up her coffee cup. She wrapped both hands around it the way she always did. She said, "Ask me properly, Elias." He looked at her. He said, "Will you stay because you want to, not because you need to?" She held his gaze for a long moment. "Yes," she said, quiet and absolute. "I will stay. No speeches, no expensive gestures, no performance of any kind. Just two people at a kitchen table at 5:30 in the morning with a supply ledger open between them and coffee going cold in their cups." It was the most complete moment Elias Blackwood had ever inhabited. But the world did not stop because two people had finally said the right thing to each other. Elias sent his mother a letter that evening. A real one, as promised. 3 pages, which was more than he'd written to her in a year. He told her about Clara. He told her about the blizzard and the accounts and the supply reorganization and the letter from the creditor. And then he stopped listing things and simply wrote, "She is the most honest person I have met since father. I believe you will understand what I mean by that." He received Eleanor's reply 8 days later. It was one sentence. "Bring her to Philadelphia in the spring, so I can tell her in person that she was right about the recipe." He read it twice. Then he laughed, a real one, sudden and unguarded, and the sound of it surprised him because he had not heard himself laugh like that in longer than he could remember. He showed the letter to Clara. She read it. She looked up. "Philadelphia in the spring," she said. "If you want to." "I've never been to Philadelphia." "It's loud," he said. "My mother is louder." She handed back the letter. "I think I can manage your mother." "I think," Elias said, "she's afraid you can too." The harder conversation came from a different direction. 3 days after the morning in the kitchen, Hank came to Elias before supper with the careful expression of a man who has something to say that he's been turning over for a while. "The men want to say something," Hank said, collectively. Elias waited. "They're glad," Hank said. "About the situation. They wanted you to know that." "That's kind of them." "It's not kindness exactly." Hank looked at the floor, then up. "It's more that she's been good for this place, and they were watching, and they weren't sure if you could see what they were seeing, and they're relieved you could." He paused. "Daniel specifically asked me to say that she made him feel like his recovery mattered. Not just that he'd get back to work, that he mattered." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Tell them I heard," he said. Hank nodded. He turned to go. "Hank." "Sir." "The payroll verification system she put in place. The dual sign-off." "Yes." "I want that to be permanent. In writing in the operational records, her name on the process." He paused. "She built it. It should carry her name." Hank looked at him. "Yes, sir," he said. He left. Elias stood alone in the hallway for a moment. I thought about a woman who had arrived with nothing but capability and had spent 6 weeks making the people around her feel like they mattered and had never once announced that she was doing it. He thought, that is what I want the rest of my life to look like. He thought I have to be worthy of that. He went into the kitchen to tell her about Hank and about Daniel and about what he'd decided about the payroll records. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That boy is going to be remarkable if someone keeps investing in him." Not "thank you for putting my name on it." Not any response about herself at all. Just "that boy is going to be remarkable." He looked at her. "I know," he said. She turned back to the stove. He sat down at the table. The house was warm around them, and the evening was settling in outside, and the ranch was quiet and functional and whole. And Elias Blackwood sat in his kitchen and felt for the first time in a very long time that the life he'd built was not just successful, it was full. Not complete in the way of finished things. Full in the way of living things, still growing, still changing with more weight and texture and difficulty and richness ahead than behind. I thought about the gate in the rain. He thought about opening it. He thought, the right decisions rarely feel like decisions when you make them. They feel like the only thing that makes sense. He picked up his coffee. Across the kitchen, Clara stirred something on the stove and hummed something low and tuneless under her breath, and the sound of it was so ordinary and so specific and so completely unperformed that it hit him somewhere under the sternum like a slow, certain weight. How was home? Not in the building, not in the land. In the particular irreplaceable reality of this woman in this kitchen on this evening. He was home. And whatever came next, the spring and Philadelphia, and all the difficulty and negotiation and beautiful ordinary complications of two stubborn, private, capable people learning to share a life. Whatever came next, he was ready for it. He had opened the gate. She had walked through it. The rest was just the work of living. And work, as it turned out, was the one thing both of them had never been afraid of. Spring came to the way it always did, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a hard frost. A thaw that retreated. Green appearing at the edges of things, then pulling back, then returning more insistently, until finally the land simply decided it was done with winter and committed. Elias noticed the change in Clara before he noticed it in the land. She had always been capable. That had been evident from the first morning. But capability and ease are different things, and what he watched happen over the months following November was Clara Whitmore slowly, almost imperceptibly, allowing herself to be at ease, to let her shoulders settle, to stop measuring every action against the internal standard of a woman who had learned the hard way that she could rely only on herself. It did not happen in a single moment. It happened in pieces, the way trust always builds. It happened the evening she fell asleep in the chair by the study fire while Elias was working, and he looked up and found her there, her book open in her lap, and he did not wake her. He put his coat over her and went back to his ledgers and did not make a single thing of it. And when she woke an hour later and looked at the coat on her lap and then at him, he simply said, You needed the sleep," and went back to what he was reading, and she sat there for a long moment before she said very quietly, "Thank you." And he said, "You don't need to thank me for that." It happened when the Whitmore debt was paid, the final payment sent to the creditor in Laramie, on a Wednesday in February, and Clara came to him that evening and told him, standing in the kitchen doorway, and the look on her face was not triumph. It was something quieter and more important than triumph. It was the look of a person who has set down something very heavy and is standing up straight for the first time in years, and Elias understood it exactly because he had looked that way himself 4 years ago when the last of the ranch debt cleared. He said, "How does it feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I can breathe all the way down," she said. He nodded. "That's exactly how it feels." They stood there together for a moment in that shared understanding, and it was worth more than any declaration either of them had made. It happened when Daniel's mother wrote a letter to the ranch addressed not to Elias, not to Hank, but to Miss Whitmore, care of Blackwood Ranch, thanking her for looking after her son. And Daniel brought the letter to Clara himself, red-faced and embarrassed, and clearly also deeply moved, and Clara read it at the kitchen table, and then carefully folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went back to what she was doing. And later that evening, Elias found her rereading it at the table, and she didn't hide it or explain it. She just looked up and said, "His mother writes a good letter. She raised a good son," Elias said. "She did." Clara folded it again. "He's going to be something, that boy." "You keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it." Philadelphia happened in April. Elias had not been certain Clara would agree to go. Not because she was afraid of Eleanor. Clara Whitmore was not afraid of much, and Eleanor Blackwood, for all her force of personality, was simply another problem to be read accurately and managed honestly. Clara had told him so in those exact terms, and he had believed her completely. What he hadn't been certain of was whether Clara was ready to be seen in that context. To stand in his mother's house and be looked at as the woman Elias Blackwood had chosen. To inhabit that role publicly and without the professional armor of housekeeper to retreat behind. He brought it up carefully one morning in March. She said, "I'm not afraid of your mother." "I know. And I'm not afraid of Philadelphia." "I know that too." She looked at him. "Then what are you actually asking?" He took a breath. "I'm asking if you're ready to be this, publicly, to people who will have opinions." Clara set down her coffee. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. "Elias, I arrived at your gate in the rain with a tired horse and a worn coat, and I told a man I'd never met that I needed work. I have never in my life done anything based on what people with opinions might think of it." She picked the coffee back up. "Book the tickets." He booked the tickets. Chaw. Eleanor met them at the station. She was dressed impeccably as always, and she stepped forward when she saw them and looked at Clara with the specific searching attention she brought to everything that mattered to her, direct, unapologetic, thorough. Clara looked back at her with the same quality. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then Eleanor said, "You're taller than I expected." "You're exactly what I expected," Clara said. Eleanor blinked. Then she laughed. A real one, sudden and unguarded, the same laugh Elias had heard from himself the day the letter arrived. He hadn't known his mother, and he had the same laugh until that moment. Eleanor took Clara's arm and walked ahead of Elias toward the carriage, already talking about the city, about the journey, about the spring weather. And Clara answered her in kind question, for question, observation, for observation. And Elias walked behind them and felt something so unfamiliar in its completeness that it took him half a block to identify it. He felt uncomplicated, not simple. The situation was not simple and would never be, but uncomplicated in himself, like a man whose internal argument has finally reached a verdict. That evening after dinner, Eleanor took him aside in the hall. "She told me about James," Eleanor said. He looked at her. While you were arguing with the carriage driver about the route." Eleanor crossed her arms. "She told me directly. Said she wanted me to know about him before I formed an impression of her without that information." She paused. "She said I want to remember this exactly. She said James Whitmore was a good man, and I loved him, and I will not pretend otherwise to make your son's position more comfortable." Elias said nothing. She was right to tell me, Eleanor said. And she was right about all of it. She looked at her son. She is not going to make your life easier, you understand. I know. She is going to make it better. Eleanor unfolded her arms. Those are not the same thing. No, Elias said. They're not. Eleanor looked at him for a moment, that long searching look she had been giving him since he was a child. And then she nodded once with the finality of a woman who has made a decision and is done deliberating. The recipe, she said, is yours. I'll have the cook write it down in the morning. It was Eleanor Blackwood's version of a blessing. He understood it completely. Ted. The twist came the night before they left Philadelphia. Elias had been expecting the journey home, the return to the ranch, the ordinary resumption of their life. He was not expecting Clara to come to him that evening with a piece of paper in her hand and a look on her face that he had learned by now to read the look of someone who has been thinking something through for a long time and has finally decided to say it. She sat across from him in Eleanor's parlor. She set the paper on the table. He looked at it. It was a letter. Her handwriting. 2 pages, dense and careful. I've been writing this since February, she said. I tore it up 4 times. He looked at her, not the letter. Before we go back, she said. I need to say something that I should have said a long time ago, and I kept not saying it because I was afraid of what it would change. She folded her hands on the table, the same gesture she made when she was about to be very honest. I have been telling myself since before November, that what I was doing at Blackwood Ranch was working. That I was an employee who had developed circumstances that were more complicated than employment, but that the foundation was still professional, because that story was safer. She paused. It was not accurate. He waited. I fell in love with your ranch, she said. Not with the land, with what you built on it. The way Hank talks to the younger men. The way old Pete tells stories that are actually lessons. The way you knew without being told that Daniel needed more responsibility, not more supervision. She stopped. I fell in love with all of that before I understood what was happening. And then I fell in love with you, and I understood exactly what was happening, and I was terrified because I had loved one person completely and lost him, and I was not sure I had the structural capacity. Her voice caught slightly just once, and she steadied it, to do that again and survive if it went wrong. The parlor was very quiet. It isn't going wrong, Elias said. No. She looked at him. That's what I'm trying to say. He leaned forward. He said, Clara, I opened that gate in October because it was raining and you needed shelter. I kept it open because of everything you were and everything you did. And I am asking you right now, not as your employer, and not as someone whose accounts you manage, and not even as a man who admires what you're capable of. I am asking you as the person who has sat across from you at a kitchen table every morning for 6 months and cannot imagine a morning without you there. He looked at her steadily. Marry me. No speech. No grand gesture. Just those 2 words said plainly by a man who meant them the way he meant everything completely and without performance. Clara looked at him for a long moment. You understand, she said, that I will still manage my own money. Yes. And I will still tell you when you're wrong. I'm counting on it. And there will be mornings when I need to be left alone, and I will need you to understand that without taking it personally. There will be evenings when I disappear into the study, he said. I'll need the same. I know. She looked at him. That's why I said yes in November, and I'm saying yes again now. He looked at her. You're saying yes. I said yes in November, Elias. I've been saying yes every morning since. She picked up the one she'd written and rewritten 4 times, and she held it for a moment. Then she set it on the table and slid it across to him. Read it when you want to. It says what I just said, but longer and less efficiently. He put his hand on top of it. He kept it there. They married in June at Blackwood Ranch under the open Wyoming sky, with Hank standing beside Elias and Martha, crying in a way she would deny until her last day on earth. Daniel held the horses. Old Pete wore his good coat, the one Clara had mended in the first week without being asked, and he stood straight and looked at the 2 of them with the expression of a man who had seen a great deal of the world and knew when he was looking at something worth seeing. Eleanor came from Philadelphia. She brought no opinions. She brought a gift, a set of account ledgers, leather-bound, and initialed CB, because she had understood from the moment Clara told her about James in a Philadelphia carriage what kind of woman her son was marrying, and she knew better than to bring her silver. Clara laughed when she opened it. It was the best laugh Elias had ever heard. At the end of the evening, when the guests had gone and the ranch was quiet, and they stood together in the kitchen that smelled of herbs and coffee and 6 months of accumulated ordinary life. Clara looked around the room she had reorganized and inhabited and made her own without ever claiming it. "This is a good house," she said. "It is now," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. No more needed to be said. Outside Blackwood Ranch stood in the last light of a June evening. 4,000 acres of Wyoming land, 260 head of cattle, a bunkhouse full of men who worked hard and were treated fairly, and a house that had spent years echoing with the wrong kind of quiet. It was quiet now too. But it was a different kind. The kind that belongs to a life that is full. A cowboy who had stopped believing had opened a gate in the rain. A widow who had stopped asking had walked through it, and what they built together on the only foundation that has ever held anything worth keeping: honesty and respect, and the daily decision to choose each other, not from need, but from certainty. What they built was not a story about wealth or rescue, or a lucky accident of timing. It was a story about two people who were exactly who they were, and found against all reasonable expectation that it was exactly enough. That is the only love worth having, and it was theirs.